My new daughter-in-law called me a fat pig at her wedding. She said it with a perfect smile, surrounded by her wealthy friends, while my own son stood by and did nothing. They all laughed. They thought they were telling a joke. They had no idea they were writing a check, one their entire family couldn't afford to cash. They didn't know that the man they were laughing at, the quiet man in the ill-fitting suit, had just bought her father's company. By the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. Before I tell you how I turned their laughter into the silence of a tomb, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Because every story of justice needs a witness. The gravel of the long, winding driveway crunched under the tires of my 10-year-old Lincoln Town Car. It was a sound that didn't belong here, a working man's sound in a world of silent German sedans and roaring Italian sports cars. The Greenwich Hills Country Club rose up before me, a monument of stone and glass and old money arrogance. I had paid for half of this wedding, a fact my son Kevin had conveniently forgotten to mention to his new family, but I still felt like I was arriving at the service entrance. I straightened my tie, the knot feeling a little too tight. The suit was a good one, Zegna, but it was 5 years old from a time before my doctor had started talking about my cholesterol in disappointed tones. On me, it looked less like a statement of success and more like a relic of a time when I bothered to try. Kevin met me at the grand entrance, his face a mixture of relief and anxiety. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but his eyes darted around nervously, as if he were afraid one of his new relatives might see us together. "Dad, you made it," he said, giving me a quick, awkward hug. "I'm so glad you're here. Just try to have a good time. Okay, Tiffany's family, they can be a little formal." Formal was Kevin's new word for rich and condescending. He had picked up a whole new vocabulary since he'd met Tiffany Sterling. A man with a perfectly coiffed head of silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes approached us. Richard Sterling, the father of the bride. He extended a soft hand, his grip weak and dismissive. "Ah, Mr. Caldwell, a pleasure to finally meet you," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Kevin has told us so much about you. You're in consulting, is that right?" The slight pause before the word consulting was a perfectly executed little insult, a verbal pat on the head for the simple working man. I just smiled. "Something like that. I help companies with their transitions." It was the truth in a way. I helped them transition from being owned by people like him to being owned by me. I looked at my son standing beside this titan of local industry, and I didn't see a 28-year-old man. I saw a little boy with grease on his cheek sitting on a stool in our cramped garage, watching me with wide eyes as I soldered a motherboard. That garage was the birthplace of my first company, a logistics software firm I built with my own 2 hands and 20 hours of work a day. Kevin remembered the smell of burnt coffee and the clutter. He didn't remember the day I sold that company for a sum that had 9 figures in it. I had used that money to give him the best education, the best opportunities, a life free from the struggles I had known. And I had used the rest to quietly build JC Capital, an investment firm so private, so anonymous, that its name was only ever whispered in the most exclusive boardrooms. I never told Kevin. I wanted him to make his own way, to build his own character without the crutch of a massive inheritance. I was beginning to see the catastrophic error in that judgment. Tiffany glided towards us, a vision in white lace and diamonds, her smile as bright and cold as a winter morning. She looked right through me. "Oh, Dad, you're here," she said, her voice tinkling like ice in a crystal glass. Her use of the word dad felt like a performance. "My mother is just dying to meet you." She took Kevin's arm, her red nails digging into the fabric of his tuxedo, and pulled him away towards a throng of guests, leaving me standing alone in the grand foyer. I was no longer a father. I was an obstacle to be managed. The reception was a blur of noise and light. The clinking of glasses, the drone of a string quartet, the braying laughter of people who had never known a single day of hardship. I found a small table in the corner and nursed a glass of club soda, watching my son as he moved through his new world. He looked like a man playing a part, his smile a little too wide, his posture a little too stiff. He was a guest in his own life. After an hour, Tiffany appeared at my side, her cheeks flushed with champagne. "There you are," she chirped, her smile dangerously bright. Come on, I have to introduce you to my friends. They're all dying to meet the man who raised my Kevin. She grabbed my arm, and her grip was like a vice. She half-dragged me across the marble floor to a circle of young men and women who all seemed to be cast from the same mold, perfect teeth, expensive clothes, and eyes that held a casual, bored cruelty. She pulled me into the center of the circle, and the chatter died down. All eyes were on me. Tiffany let go of my arm and looped her own through her new husband's. Kevin stood beside her, a statue with a forced smile. "Everyone," Tiffany announced, her voice carrying across the immediate area with practiced clarity. "I want you to meet my new father-in-law." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes sweeping over the faces of her adoring audience. Then she looked directly at me, her smile widening into a smirk. "This," she said, her voice dripping with mock affection, "is the fat pig we have to put up with." For a moment, there was silence, a shocked, suspended breath in the air. Then one of the young men snickered. Another one joined in. And then the whole circle erupted in a wave of laughter. It wasn't polite, hidden laughter. It was loud, open, and vicious. I saw Richard Sterling standing nearby, not laughing, but with a deep, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He raised his glass in a silent toast. But my eyes were on my son. Kevin's face was pale, his smile gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shame. He looked at the floor. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his new wife. He looked anywhere but at me. He said nothing, not a single word. In the face of his wife's cruelty, in the face of his father's public humiliation, my son chose silence. He chose them. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The hurt, the shock, the anger. It all just vanished, burned away by a sudden, chilling clarity. I didn't get angry. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. My heart rate didn't even quicken. I just looked at Tiffany, holding her gaze until her triumphant smile began to falter, until she saw something in my eyes that she didn't understand. Something cold and ancient and absolute. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then I turned my back on their laughter and walked away. I found an empty terrace overlooking the 18th green. The cool night air felt good on my face. I needed a moment for the pieces to settle, to arrange themselves into a new picture. The sound of the party faded behind me, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets. I was standing there in the quiet dark when I heard a voice. It was Richard Sterling, his back to me, talking on his phone in a hushed, frantic tone. "I don't care what you have to do," he hissed into the receiver. "You find out who they are. What the hell is JC Capital? How did they buy up that debt from the bank without anyone knowing? This is my family's company. I will not let some faceless corporate raider steal it from me. Find them. I want a name." I stepped back into the shadows, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time that night. A name. He wanted a name. I stood there listening to the panic in his voice, and I thought about the garage. I thought about the satisfaction of building something from nothing, of watching disparate parts come together to create a powerful, efficient machine. I had spent my life building. Now I would turn my talents to the art of disassembly. The wedding was over. The gift had been given. It was time for me to give mine. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. And Richard Sterling had no idea he was already in checkmate. The sun rose over Manhattan, but I had been awake for hours. I wasn't tossing and turning. I wasn't replaying the humiliation in my mind. I had slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind of rest that comes only when a chaotic world snaps into a single clear purpose. The anger I had felt wasn't a hot, messy thing. It had cooled and hardened overnight into something far more useful, a tool. My son Kevin believed I lived in a small, tidy house in a quiet New Jersey suburb. It was a comfortable home, filled with memories of his mother, a place I kept for the sake of appearances, a stage for the role of the simple retired consultant he needed me to be. But this was not that house. I stood in my real home. A penthouse apartment bordering Central Park, a place of clean lines, polished concrete floors, and glass walls that stretched from floor to ceiling. The space was minimalist, almost monastic. There was no clutter. A single powerful abstract painting hung on one wall, its violent slashes of color a stark contrast to the serene gray and white of the room. The only other decoration was the city of New York itself sprawling out below me like a map of my own ambition. I was wearing silk pajamas, the fabric cool against my skin, and sipping a glass of water that was probably more expensive than the wine they had served at the wedding. I walked over to the onyx black wall that housed my communication center. There was no phone, no laptop cluttering the space. I simply said, "Computer, video call David Chen." A section of the wall shimmered and came to life, revealing a high-definition screen. After a moment, David's face appeared. He was in his own home office, already dressed in a crisp shirt and tie, a bookcase filled with leather-bound law tomes behind him. He looked sharp, alert, and ready. He always was. "Sir, good morning," he said, his voice professional and even. "I trust you had a pleasant weekend." I took a sip of my water. The weekend was illuminating, David. I walked over to the window, looking down at the yellow cabs that looked like tiny insects from this height. "Let's talk about Sterling Manufacturing." David nodded, his fingers tapping on a keyboard I couldn't see. "Of course. We're proceeding as planned. The final tranche of convertible debt was acquired Friday afternoon. We now hold a controlling interest. The transition plan is ready to be implemented. We'll allow Richard Sterling to stay on as CEO for 6 months to ensure a smooth handover, manage the Q4 rollout, and prevent any panic among the staff or suppliers. After that, we install our own leadership and begin the restructuring." I turned from the window and looked directly into the camera. "The plan has changed." David paused, his professional mask unwavering, but I could see a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had worked for me for 15 years. He knew that I never changed a plan unless the fundamental variables had been altered. "Sir, the 6-month transition is cancelled," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The restructuring begins now. I want you to assemble the legal team. I want a full forensic audit of Sterling Manufacturing's books going back 5 years. I want every expense account, every supplier contract, every board minute, every executive bonus analyzed. Find the waste, find the vanity projects, find the fiscal mismanagement that has been bleeding this company dry. I want a legally airtight reason to terminate Richard Sterling's contract for cause." David was silent for a long moment, processing. He wasn't questioning my authority, he was calculating the logistics, the potential blowback. "Sir, a hostile removal of a legacy CEO could be destabilizing. It could spook the market and the employees. Richard is the face of that company." "Richard Sterling is the face of its decline," I corrected him. "He inherited a thoroughbred and has been treating it like a pony at a child's birthday party. The workforce is already destabilized, David. They just don't know it yet. They're working for a company that is 3 months from insolvency, a fact their CEO has been hiding with creative accounting and loans he had no intention of repaying." This was the truth David and I had uncovered during our due diligence. Sterling Manufacturing was a hollow shell, a respected name propped up by debt and delusion. Our original plan was a quiet surgical rescue. We would buy it for pennies on the dollar, trim the fat, install competent management, and restore it to profitability. It was just business. It was what JC Capital did. We found undervalued assets and made them valuable again. But as I stood there looking at the rising sun glinting off the skyscrapers, I realized it was no longer just business. Last night at that wedding, Richard Sterling had smirked while his daughter called me a pig. He had toasted my humiliation. He had watched my son's betrayal and approved of it. It stopped being about the bottom line. It became about the punchline. "I don't want to give him a golden parachute, David," I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "I want to give him a cardboard box and a security escort to the parking lot." David's expression shifted. The professional concern was replaced by a look of crisp, loyal understanding. He knew me well enough to know this was no longer a negotiation. It was an execution. "And the leadership?" he asked. "I will personally assume the role of chairman of the board," I said. "Effective immediately. Call an emergency board meeting for next Monday. Attendance mandatory. Inform them the new owner will be present to outline the company's future." "Understood, sir. And Mr. Sterling?" "Don't tell him who the new owner is," I said. "Let him spend the week sweating. Let him wonder which of his country club rivals has come to carve up his family's legacy. Let him exhaust every favor and call in every marker. Let him walk into that boardroom next Monday full of fear but still clinging to a sliver of hope. A faint smile touched my lips. Hope is what makes the fall so much more memorable. David Chen, the most ruthless lawyer I had ever known, allowed himself a small, appreciative nod. Understood, sir. I'll have the preliminary report on grounds for termination on your desk by noon today. The board will be notified within the hour. Thank you, David. The screen went black, returning to its perfect onyx sheen. The penthouse was silent again, save for the low hum of the air filtration system. I walked to the kitchen, a sleek expanse of Italian marble and stainless steel, and pressed a button on the built-in espresso machine. The sound of beans being ground filled the air. As the machine worked, I looked at my reflection in the polished chrome. The man looking back wasn't the out-of-place father in the old suit from last night. That man was a fiction, a costume I wore for my son's benefit. The man standing here now was the real me, the one who had built an empire from a garage, the one who understood that in business, as in life, you either eat or you are eaten. The machine hissed, delivering a perfect shot of espresso into a small porcelain cup. I took a sip, the bitter hot liquid, a welcome shock to my system. Tiffany had wanted to introduce her friends to the pig. That was fine. Pigs are useful animals. They are patient. They are intelligent. And they can find truffles hidden deep in the earth. But they had made a critical mistake. They laughed at the pig. They're about to meet the butcher. My phone began to buzz on the marble countertop, a harsh, insistent vibration in the morning silence. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew who it was. I let it ring, counting the seconds. 1, 2. He was calling from his honeymoon suite in Bora Bora, a trip I had paid for. 3, 4. He was calling because his new wife, or more likely his new father-in-law, had told him to perform damage control. 5. On the 6th ring I answered. Hello, Kevin. His voice was a nervous rush of words. Dad. Hey. I'm so glad I caught you. I just wanted to call and say, I'm really sorry about last night. I could hear the ocean in the background, a gentle rhythmic shushing that was the complete opposite of the frantic energy in his voice. Tiffany, she had way too much champagne, you know. And with the stress of the wedding and everything, she just wasn't herself. She feels absolutely terrible about it. We both do. The excuses were as flimsy and transparent as the silk curtains that covered my windows. He wasn't apologizing for what she did. He was apologizing for the fact that she did it in public. He wasn't sorry for the insult. He was scared of the consequences. There's a difference. A man who is truly sorry doesn't blame the champagne. I walked over to the window and looked down at the city. A river of yellow cabs flowed up Fifth Avenue. People with places to be, things to build, lives to live. They all looked so small from up here. Kevin, I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable. You're on your honeymoon. You shouldn't be worrying about this. There was a pause on his end. This wasn't the reaction he had rehearsed for. He was expecting me to yell, to demand an apology from her, to make a scene. My calm was a foreign language to him. But Dad, I just feel awful. He insisted, his voice cracking a little. It was a horrible thing to say. It was a joke, a stupid, terrible joke that just came out wrong. A joke. I thought about the word. A joke is meant to be shared. The only thing they shared last night was their contempt for me. I watched a single hawk circle over Central Park, a master of its domain, patient and observant. There is nothing to feel awful about, I said, the politeness in my voice a weapon in itself. It's in the past. It's done. Now I want you to hang up this phone, go find your wife, and enjoy the beach. That's an order from your old man. But Dad, go, I said, my voice a little firmer, a final non-negotiable command. Enjoy Bora Bora. Send me a postcard. I ended the call before he could say another word, before he could spin another lie. I placed the phone back on the countertop and stood there for a long moment, the silence of the penthouse pressing in on me. A part of me, the part that was still a father before anything else, had wanted to believe him. It wanted to hear real remorse in his voice. But the man who had answered that phone, the chairman of JC Capital, knew better. That phone call wasn't an act of love. It was a business transaction. He was trying to manage an asset to smooth over a perceived problem with a key stakeholder. He had learned his new family's language all too well. My son had made his choice last night when he stood in silence, and I had made mine this morning. Now it was time to execute the next step. I picked up the phone again. There was no hesitation. Computer call Mark O'Connell. A moment later, a warm, familiar voice came on the line. Jim, good to hear from you. How was the big day? You must be one proud papa. Mark was my real estate lawyer, a straight shooter from Queens who had handled all my property dealings for 20 years. He was one of the few people who knew about both the modest house in Jersey and the penthouse in Manhattan. The day was illuminating, Mark, I said, cutting through the pleasantries. I need you to do something for me. It's regarding the Greenwich property. The big wedding gift. Of course, he said. What's on your mind? The happy couple wants to add a swimming pool already? Something like that, I said. I want to move the title into a trust, a revocable trust, effective immediately. I heard the sound of a pen scribbling on a notepad. No problem at all, Jim. We can have that filed by the end of the day. You want it under the James Caldwell Revocable Trust, is that right? Beneficiary, your son, Kevin Caldwell. It was a standard question, a simple confirmation. I looked out the window again at the vast, sprawling city. So many people all hoping for a chance, a scholarship, a lucky break, an education. The one gift I had tried so hard to give my son, the one he had so thoroughly squandered. No, Mark, I said, my voice perfectly steady. The beneficiary will be the Columbia University Underprivileged Student Scholarship Fund. The scribbling on the other end of the line stopped. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Mark was a professional. He would never ask why. He didn't have to. A move like this the day after a wedding was a statement louder than any argument. It was a declaration of war. Finally, he cleared his throat. Understood, Jim, he said, his voice now all business. The beneficiary is the Columbia University Underprivileged Student Scholarship Fund. I will draft the documents and send them to you for electronic signature within the hour. Thank you, Mark. I ended the call. It was done. The first move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. The foundation of their new life, the magnificent 7-bedroom house in Greenwich that Tiffany had been dreaming of, the ultimate symbol of her social triumph, was no longer theirs. It was a ghost, a mirage. Right now, she was likely sitting on a white sand beach sipping a cocktail with a little umbrella in it, flipping through architecture magazines on her tablet, planning the renovations, imagining the garden parties she would host. She was blissfully, arrogantly unaware that she was making plans for a house that belonged to 1,000 future students she would never meet. I had given my son a home, a place to build a family, a foundation upon which to create a life of value and integrity. But a foundation is only as strong as the people who stand on it, and their ground was about to give way. A week passed, a week of silence. From my penthouse, the city was a silent movie of ambition and motion. For Kevin and Tiffany, it was a sun-drenched dream in Bora Bora, a fantasy paid for by a man they held in contempt. For Richard Sterling, it was the beginning of a quiet, creeping dread. My legal team, led by David Chen, had descended upon Sterling Manufacturing's financials like a pack of wolves. Every number was scrutinized, every transaction questioned. David gave me daily reports not just on the numbers, but on the atmosphere, the mood inside the company. The word was out. Something was happening. A shark was circling. David painted a vivid picture for me of Richard Sterling's office. It was exactly as I'd imagined. A cavernous room on the top floor, paneled in dark mahogany, that seemed to absorb all the light. A desk the size of a small car, kept perfectly clear, except for a gold-plated pen set. Behind it, a massive oil painting of his own father, the founder of the company, scowling down with an expression of perpetual disappointment. The only other decorations were Richard's own achievements, framed and mounted on the walls, an award for Regional Businessman of the Year. From a decade ago, a photo of him shaking hands with a forgotten politician, a plaque from the local country club for a golf tournament he'd won. It wasn't an office. It was a museum dedicated to a man who believed his own press releases. It was into this museum that Kevin and Tiffany walked on the Friday after their return. They were tan-glowing and utterly oblivious. They found Richard standing by the window, a glass of Macallan 25 in his hand, staring down at the factory floor. David's sources told me he put on a magnificent performance of a king surveying his kingdom. "Ah, the happy couple," he boomed, turning to face them with a wide, confident smile. "How was the South Pacific? Did you get all that relaxation out of your systems? It's time to get back to the real world." "It was amazing, Dad," Tiffany said, kissing his cheek. "But it's good to be home." She looked around the office with a proprietary air, as if she were already measuring for new curtains. Richard laughed, a deep rumbling sound that was meant to convey power. "Good. Because big things are happening. We're looking at a new facility in the Midwest, fully automated, the future of American manufacturing. I've been working on it for months." This was a lie. The only thing he had been working on for months was trying to secure another loan to cover his payroll. Kevin, ever the dutiful son-in-law, looked impressed. "That's incredible, sir." "It's what we do, son," Richard said, clapping him on the shoulder. He walked over to his liquor cabinet to refresh his drink. "You know, there was a little hiccup a few weeks ago. Some vulture fund trying to make a play for our debt. But that's all been sorted. You just have to remind these people who they're dealing with. The Sterling name still means something in this state." He was a man whistling past a graveyard. The vulture fund hadn't been scared off. It had simply finished its meal. He then turned to them, his chest puffed out with pride, and delivered the line that would seal his fate. "In fact," he said, "you two should come to the board meeting on Monday morning. It'll be a good experience for you. A little lesson in how a real empire is run. See your old man in action." He winked at Tiffany. "It's time you saw what you married into." It was at that precise moment of peak arrogance that the door to his office burst open. His secretary, a woman named Carol, who had been with the company for 30 years, stood there, her face pale and her hands trembling. She was holding a single piece of paper, a printed-out email, as if it were radioactive. "Mr. Sterling, sir," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "I am so sorry to interrupt, but this just came through. It's marked urgent and legally binding." Richard's jovial mask vanished, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "Carol, what have I told you about interrupting me when I have guests?" He snatched the paper from her hand, his eyes scanning the first few lines. I can picture it perfectly. The way his confident posture would have deflated ever so slightly. The way the color would have begun to drain from his face as he read the cold corporate prose my lawyers had so carefully crafted. I knew the words by heart. "Pursuant to the acquisition of a majority controlling interest in all assets and outstanding debts of Sterling Manufacturing by its new parent company, JC Capital." Parent company. The words would have hung in the air, deadly and alien. Sterling Manufacturing had never had a parent company. It was the parent. Richard read on, his lips moving silently. "An emergency meeting of the Board of Directors is hereby convened for Monday at 9:00 a.m. sharp. The purpose of this meeting is to outline the strategic transition and introduce the new leadership. Attendance is mandatory. The presence of the new owner is confirmed." He lowered the paper, his hand shaking. Tiffany looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Dad, what is it? What's JC Capital?" Richard tried to laugh it off, but the sound was brittle hollow. It's nothing. It's the bankers. They love these little power plays, sending threatening letters, trying to scare the old guard." He tossed the paper onto his massive desk. "It's just a tactic. They just need to be reminded where the real power lies." But his voice lacked its earlier boom. The king suddenly looked very small in his very large office. Kevin, who had seen true quiet power in his own father even if he didn't recognize it, could see the difference. He saw the fear behind the bluster. Carol still lingered by the door. "Sir," she whispered, "the email was sent to every board member. And the SEC filing was posted 2 minutes ago. It's public." The room fell silent. Public. The fight could no longer be hidden. The weakness was exposed for the world to see. Richard Sterling stared at the piece of paper on his desk, as if it were his own death warrant. The confident CEO had vanished, replaced by a man who had just been informed that he was no longer the master of his own house. From my perch high above the city, I lowered the tablet on which David had sent me the security feed transcript from Carol's desk. Richard would spend the entire weekend in a frantic daze, calling every contact he had, pulling every string, leveraging every old friendship, desperately trying to find the name behind JC Capital. He would search for that name in all the usual places: at the country club, on the yacht registries, in the donor lists for the governor's re-election campaign. But he was looking in all the wrong places. He was looking for an equal and adversary from his own gilded world. He never would have thought to look for the name of the man his daughter had called a pig. He never would have thought to look in a dusty garage 20 years in the past. The boardroom at Sterling Manufacturing felt like a room holding its breath. It was a space designed to project power, with a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the nervous faces of the men sitting around it. A portrait of Richard Sterling's father hung on the wall, his stern gaze a constant silent judgment. The air was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and cheap fear. The entire board was present, a collection of old men in well-tailored suits, their faces a mixture of loyalty and anxiety. They were here to meet the ghost that had been haunting their company for the past week. At the far end of the table near the head sat Tiffany and Kevin. They were here as invited guest spectators to what Richard had promised would be a masterclass in corporate power. Tiffany looked radiant, wearing a sharp white business dress, ready to play the part of the heiress apparent. Kevin, however, looked uncomfortable. He kept adjusting his tie, his eyes flitting towards the door. The week of his father's silence had unnerved him more than any angry phone call could have. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the table, the chairman's seat, though he didn't sit. He was performing. He paced back and forth, trying to project an aura of calm control, but his movements were too sharp, his smile too tight. He had spent the weekend calling in every favor, leveraging every connection, and had come up with nothing. JC Capital was a phantom, a black hole that had swallowed his company's debt and equity without a trace. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming on such short notice." He began, his voice a little too loud. "I know there's been some speculation this past week. Rumors, market jitters. It's all nonsense. Just a bit of Wall Street theatrics. We're in a stronger position than ever." He was lying, and every man in that room knew it. They were looking at a captain trying to convince his crew that the iceberg was just a minor inconvenience. Tiffany watched him with adoration, completely buying the performance. Kevin just stared at the polished surface of the table, watching a distorted reflection of himself. Right on schedule at 9 o'clock precisely, the heavy oak doors at the end of the room swung open. The conversations stopped. Every head turned. First to enter was David Chen. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, his face a mask of professional calm. He carried a slim leather portfolio and moved with an efficiency that made the other men in the room look soft and slow. He stepped to one side, holding the door open, and then I walked in. The man who entered the boardroom was not the man from the wedding. That man was a ghost, a carefully constructed illusion of mediocrity. That man was soft and rumpled, and wore his invisibility like a comfortable old coat. This man was different. I was wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, the dark charcoal fabric fitting me like a second skin. It was the kind of suit that acted as armor and a weapon all at once. I had lost the slight paunch I'd carried, the result of a week of renewed discipline and a diet of nothing but cold fury. My hair was cut short, styled precisely. My face was clean-shaven. I walked with a purpose I hadn't allowed myself to show in years. I wasn't the father-in-law. I wasn't the retired consultant. I was the founder and sole owner of JC Capital. I was the shark they had been afraid of. Silence. A deep, profound, and terrified silence descended on the room. The board members looked from me to Richard, and back again, their faces a canvas of confusion. Who was this stranger? But Richard knew. His face, which had been artificially flushed with false confidence, went completely white. It was the color of bone. The glass of water in his hand trembled, the ice cubes rattling against the side. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost from a nightmare he didn't know he'd had. "Caldwell." He finally managed to croak the name, a ragged whisper. What are you doing here?" Next to him, Tiffany's perfect smiling face collapsed. Her eyes widened. Her painted red lips parted in a silent gasp of disbelief. The world tilted on its axis. The pieces of her perfect life began to click into a new, horrific configuration. The fat pig. The ill-fitting suit. The man she had mocked. The man her father was terrified of. They were the same person. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll that had just been shattered. I didn't look at them. I didn't acknowledge their shock. My eyes were fixed on one thing: the empty chairman's seat at the head of the table. I walked the length of the room, my footsteps the only sound, each one a hammer blow against the foundation of their world. I didn't stop until I reached the head of the table, right next to where Richard was standing, frozen in place. I pulled out the heavy leather chair, the legs scraping against the floor, and I sat down. I owned this seat. I had bought it. I placed my own leather briefcase on the table, its solid weight a statement of permanence. David Chen stepped forward into the silence. He moved to the side of the table, opened his portfolio, and addressed the room. His voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his eyes sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. "My name is David Chen. I am Executive Vice President of JC Capital." He let that name hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of it crush any remaining doubt. "As you are all now aware," he continued, "JC Capital is the new parent company and sole owner of Sterling Manufacturing. On behalf of JC Capital, I would like to introduce you to your new chairman of the board." David paused and turned his head slightly, gesturing towards me. "Mr. Jameson Caldwell." The name hit the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the board members. They looked at me, then at Richard's ashen face, then at Tiffany's look of utter horror. The puzzle was complete. This wasn't a corporate takeover. This was a public execution. Richard Sterling made a small wounded sound like air escaping a punctured tire. His legs seemed to give way, and he stumbled backward, collapsing into the chair beside mine. He wasn't the king in his castle anymore. He was just an old man who had just been evicted. I looked across the table and my eyes met Kevin's for the first time. I saw the shame and the fear that had been there at the wedding. But I saw something else now, too. A dawning, terrifying understanding. He was finally seeing his father, not the retired consultant who lived in a quiet house in Jersey. He was seeing the man who had built an empire from a garage, the man he had never known, the man he had betrayed. I reached forward and flipped the 2 gold latches on my briefcase. The sharp metallic click echoed through the dead silent room. It was the sound of a lid closing on a coffin. It was the sound of a new chapter beginning. The show was over. The lesson was about to begin. I lifted the lid of my briefcase, and the sound seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the room. Inside there were no complex devices, no secret weapons. There was only a stack of neatly organized manila folders. Paper, the most powerful and underrated weapon in the world. I slid the top folder out and placed it on the polished table. Its simple plain cover was an affront to the mahogany grandeur of the room. I directed my attention to the man slumped in the chair beside me. "Richard," I said, my voice quiet, forcing everyone in the room to lean in to strain to hear their king's dethronement. "Let's start with the facts. Sterling Manufacturing has posted a net loss for 5 consecutive quarters. Your debt-to-equity ratio is unsustainable. You have personally authorized executive bonuses, including one to yourself. At the same time, you were freezing employee wages, citing market pressures." I opened the folder. Inside were financial statements highlighted in yellow and red. I didn't need to read them. I had memorized every number. The loans you took out from 3 different banks to cover these losses were bundled and sold 6 months ago. JC Capital was the buyer. For the past 6 months, Richard, every paycheck you've signed, every supplier you've paid, you've done so with my money. His face was a mess of sagging, defeated flesh. His eyes, which had once held such casual arrogance, were now just glassy pools of terror. He tried to speak, but only a dry clicking sound came from his throat. "So," I continued, pushing the folder gently across the table until it stopped directly in front of him. "You have 2 options this morning." I raised one finger. "Option 1. Inside this folder is a resignation letter drafted by my legal team. It cites personal health reasons. You will sign it. In return, you will receive a modest severance package enough for a comfortable, if not extravagant, retirement. You will walk out of this company today and never return. Your legacy, tarnished as it is, will remain largely a private matter. I raised a second finger. Option 2. You refuse, at which point I will have you removed from this boardroom by security. You will be terminated for cause effective immediately. And the contents of this second folder, I tapped another folder in my briefcase, which details what my forensic accountants believe to be a pattern of shareholder fraud and deliberate financial misrepresentation, will be turned over to the SEC and the District Attorney's Office. The choice is yours, Richard. A quiet end or a very, very public one. He stared at the folder as if it were a coiled snake. His hand trembled as he reached for it. It was then that Tiffany found her voice. It was a broken, desperate sound. "Dad, please, don't," she sobbed, looking at me. "Mr. Caldwell, Jim, I am so sorry. I wasn't myself. I didn't mean it." I turned my head and looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since I had entered the room. Her beautiful face was ruined by tears and terror. Her mask had not just slipped, it had melted. "You didn't mean what, Tiffany?" I asked, my voice genuinely curious. "You didn't mean to gather your friends. You didn't mean to have a little fun at the old man's expense. You didn't mean to call me a fat pig." The ugly words hung in the silent, sterile air of the boardroom. She flinched as if I had struck her. "No, it was a joke." "I see," I said, nodding slowly. "A joke." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a long, white envelope. I also have a sense of humor. For instance, I find irony to be very amusing. I held up the envelope. "This concerns the house in Greenwich. The one I purchased as a wedding gift for you and my son." A flicker of desperate hope ignited in her eyes. Perhaps this was a negotiation. Perhaps this was her way back. "I had a long talk with my lawyer and my financial advisor this week," I said. "We decided that such a significant asset could be put to better use." I tossed the envelope onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a stop in front of her. "The deed to that house was transferred this morning. I've donated the property in its entirety to a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. The Tiffany and Kevin Caldwell Home for Future Leaders. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Her face crumpled. The last sliver of hope died, replaced by a raw, guttural despair. She stared at the envelope, her dreams of garden parties and social triumphs turning to ash in her mouth. I then reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a small standard business check. I slid it across the table towards her. It fluttered to a stop next to the envelope. "This, however, is for you," I said. "It's a check for $5,000. It should be enough to cover the deposit on a small apartment and the cost of a moving truck. I've always believed in helping those in need." The final calculated cruelty of the gesture landed perfectly. I had taken her insult, her worldview, and turned it back on her with surgical precision. Finally, I turned my gaze to the last person at the table, my son. Kevin hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He had just watched the complete and total demolition of the world he had tried so desperately to join. He was looking at me now, and his eyes were a chaotic storm of fear, shame, and something else I hadn't seen before, a sliver of awe. My voice softened, losing its hard, clinical edge, but none of its authority. "Kevin." He flinched as if the sound of his own name was a shock. "A year ago," I said, "before you even met Tiffany, I told you there was a job waiting for you at JC Capital if you ever wanted it. A junior analyst position. Do you remember?" He nodded numbly, unable to speak. "The position is still open," I said. "It's in the basement. You'll fetch coffee. You'll run spreadsheets. You will be the lowest man on the totem pole. You'll start from the absolute bottom with no special treatment. You will learn the value of building something with your own hands the way I did. You will earn your own dignity. Or," I paused, letting the weight of the alternative settle, "you can go with her. You can try to build a life on a foundation of apologies and regrets." I stood up the chair, making a soft scraping sound against the floor. I looked down at my son, a broken man-child, sitting amidst the ruins of his choices. "You have 24 hours to call David Chen with your decision." I fastened the single button on my Tom Ford jacket, the movement crisp and final. I didn't look at Richard as he shakily signed his own corporate death warrant. I didn't look at Tiffany as she sobbed into her hands. I didn't look at anyone. I turned my back on the wreckage I had created, and I walked towards the heavy oak doors. The doors closed behind me with a solid, definitive click. The battle was over. The order was restored. I had not destroyed them with rage, but with consequences. I had held up a mirror and they had shattered themselves against their own reflection. As I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a debt that had finally been paid in full. I had lost a son, but I had found myself again. And in the silence of my own empire, that was a victory. This story is a powerful lesson about the quiet strength that lies beneath a simple exterior. It's a stark reminder that judging individuals by their appearance or perceived social standing is a profound and often costly mistake. True power isn't found in boastful words or inherited wealth, but in the silent, methodical work of a lifetime. Respect and dignity are the cornerstones of all relationships. When those cornerstones are arrogantly shattered, the architect of that disrespect will inevitably find themselves standing in the ruins, having underestimated the foundation they chose to destroy. What did you think of Jameson's ultimate lesson in respect? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the underestimated finally hold the cards.